Hello. It's my pleasure to join the Huntington's Victoria community again for one of these community conferences. Today, I'll be telling you about our work at the Florey Institute, particularly the work on lifestyle and environmental factors, and those relating to exercise and other forms of physical activity. So just to introduce the kind of research that's going on at the Florey Institute, you can see that all of these major neurological and psychiatric disorders are within the realm of our research at the Florey. But Huntington's disease remains a major focus for my group at the Florey Institute. To introduce Huntington's disease, this audience is very familiar, but in the broader context, there are now over 50 disorders that are caused by a so-called genetic stutter, a repeating sequence of DNA, different sequences from those that cause Huntington's disease. But nevertheless, if we can understand some of these other disorders, like these spinocerebellar ataxias, for example, and Friedreich ataxia, then it may inform Huntington's disease and help us develop therapies for Huntington's and other disorders. We've been working for many years on this very accurate mouse model of Huntington's disease. So there's a fragment of the human Huntington's gene in the genome of these mice, and it carries the CAG repeat expansion, and therefore it causes disease that looks very similar to what occurs clinically in Huntington's families. And so that we can model these cognitive deficits that culminate in dementia, the psychiatric symptoms that model, for example, depression in HD, and we were the first group in the world to be able to model depression in an animal model of Huntington's, and also the movement disorder, for example, chorea. As part of this, we want to understand the very early changes that occur within the brains, but in fact, also within the bodies of these mice, in particular molecules and cells. And if we can identify particular molecules that are intrinsically related to the disease and the disease symptoms, this will help us develop new approaches to treatments. We've been interested in the idea that Huntington's is not just a disorder of the brain, that it involves changes within the rest of the body. And we and others have been able to show, using animal models of Huntington's, like these HD mice, that changes not only occur within the brain, but also in other organs. And we've shown this across a number of studies over many years, in the way changes in the heart, for example, and the adrenal glands and the retina and other areas of the body are affected by Huntington's disease. Most recently, we looked at the gut of these mice, and we studied these bacteria that inhabit the gut of mice, and in fact, they inhabit the gut of humans as well. So if you imagine you have approximately 1 trillion cells in your body, if you count all the bacteria within your body, including the gut, then there are well over 1 trillion bacterial cells. So if we to count the total number of cells in our bodies, each of us is actually more bacterial than we are human, which is an extraordinary thought. There's an interrelationship between the gut and the brain that involves these 1 trillion or so bacteria within the gut. And we've been wanting to study these and investigate what's happening in Huntington's disease. So Geraldine Kong in my group did the first study, in fact, the first study in the world to study this gut microbiome, or these microbiota, particularly the bacteria in the gut of the mice, and how they relate to human Huntington's disease. And so she was able to use these techniques, which involve DNA sequencing and molecular biology, analyzing these microbiome components by analyzing the feces or the poo from the mice. And so she was able to do this and classify the different bacteria within the gut, both in the normal control mice, but also in this mouse model of Huntington's disease. And Geraldine was able to show that Huntington's disease in these mice disrupts the gut microbiome. This is the first evidence, as I said, either preclinically or clinically. And so we've followed this up more recently in collaboration with Julie Stout, where her clinical study was able to show that, in fact, what we discovered in the mice is also occurring in clinical Huntington's. And this is ongoing research, both in the mouse model in my lab and the clinical studies with Julie and Yifat and colleagues. So here's a summary, the idea of how the gut might interact with the brain. And Carol Goubert in my group is leading this work with a number of students, this ongoing research, to try and understand the extent to which the change in the microbiome may contribute not only to gut problems, but potentially to the brain problems in Huntington's disease. So we're urgently investigating this because we think it may give us insights into developing new therapies for Huntington's disease. Of course, this may also inform how the environment can affect diseases such as Huntington's disease. And so we were the first to show many years ago, 2 decades ago now, that environmental factors can also modify Huntington's. We showed firstly with the combination of physical activity and cognitive stimulation that we call environmental enrichment, that this could delay the onset of Huntington's. And our colleagues around the world were able to follow this up in studies of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other diseases. So compared to control mice, we gave the mice extra novelty and complexity in their environment to increase their cognitive stimulation, their sensory stimulation, but also their opportunities for voluntary physical activity or exercise. And what we found in this first study was that these Huntington's mice shown up here, by about 5 months of age, which is adulthood, 100% were showing this movement disorder, these motor symptoms of Huntington's disease, whereas those that received the environmental enrichment with increased physical activity and cognitive stimulation had a dramatic delay in onset. And we've been able to follow this up in many different ways and show that there's a robust effect, and that, in fact, physical activity on its own or running on running wheels for the mice was able to delay onset of Huntington's disease. And so we've been wanting to understand how these environmental factors might delay onset and progression of Huntington's disease in order to develop new therapies. Here's these running wheels that the mice used, modeling increased exercise or physical activity in the mice. And so out of these studies, we're also trying to understand particular molecules that might be affected by environmental stimuli like physical activity, and using this to develop new therapies that I call environmemetics, which would mimic or enhance the beneficial effects of cognitive stimulation and physical activity. I propose that there may be 2 major subclasses of environmemetics. One would be called epimemetics, which are specific epigenetic targeting drugs that mimic or enhance the beneficial effects of cognitive stimulation and physical activity. Another subclass, which we've recently published on, is exercise mimetics. And these would be new drugs or other therapeutics which mimic or enhance the beneficial effects of physical exercise, or in fact, other forms of physical activity. And so we might use this approach, if you like, for a drug screening approach, whereby we could identify targets, or what we call molecular targets, for new therapies, potentially new drugs that could then go into clinical trials for Huntington's and potentially a range of other disorders like Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Parkinson's disease, and so on. So finally, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the wonderful people who did all this work at the Florey Institute, particularly the researchers I mentioned today, and particularly work there involving Thibaut Renoir, Xin Du, Carol Goubert, Christina Mo, Shan Li, Dean Wright, Volkan Zungul, Iselene Mies, and many others. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer questions in the question and discussion session. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to the Huntington's Victoria Community Day, and thank you for joining us wherever you're joining us from, whether it's in person or online. We're happy to have you join the community today. My name is Dr. Brendan McLaren, and I'll be presenting on some of my doctoral research today with the presentation titled Greater Time in Bed and Less Physical Activity Associate with Poorer Cognitive Performance in HD. Today I'm presenting on behalf of my supervisory team, which is Professor Sean Drummond, Dr. Ifat Glickman-Johnston, Professor Clement Loy, Professor Mark Balgrove, Professor Julie Stout, and Dr. Sophie Andrews, without whose help and collaboration I wouldn't be here today to present to you. When I was starting my doctoral research program, I had a question in mind, which was, can healthy sleep and exercise habits benefit cognition, that is thinking skills, in HD? And I think this is an important question because in the absence of treatment or cures, it's important to be able to give you guys as members of the HD community options for how you can manage your symptoms. And even if treatments come through, those treatments may not work for everybody, or we still may need to pair those treatments with other ways of managing symptoms and slowing symptom onset. And I was interested in understanding if sleep and physical activity might be ways of managing cognitive symptoms. Now, we do know that healthy sleep and physical activity benefit cognition in general. So this is in children, in adolescents, in adults, and older adults. We also know that healthy sleep and physical activity can benefit cognition in Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And even there's evidence to show that if you get a healthy level of exercise through your lifetime, that can actually reduce the risk that a person might develop Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. So we see sleep and physical activity being important in general, and also for people with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which have some overlap and similarity with HD. But the problem is we actually so far only have a small amount of research and a little bit of evidence about how sleep and physical activity relate to cognition, thinking abilities in HD. The small amount of evidence we have has shown, for example, that waking later, so kind of like maybe sleeping in, seems to associate with poorer cognitive functioning in HD. We know this from two studies by Aziz and Diego and colleagues. So again, they showed that those people who are maybe sleeping in a little bit and waking up later were performing worse on tests of cognition and thinking ability than people who were waking up earlier in the morning. And we also have a small amount of evidence to show that people in this study by Wallace et al., who were less physically active, perform poorer on tests of cognition than people with HD who are more physically active. So less physically active, not doing as well on the tests of cognitive abilities and thinking abilities. Now, one thing I want to note about these very few studies, there's only 3 here for us to talk about, so that's why we need to keep doing research and why I ran this study. One thing I want to note about those studies is when they tested people's cognitive ability, how well they were able to do these mental tasks, they tested them in the clinic, so in the hospital or in the university or something like that. They didn't test how people were actually functioning in their home, in the real environment that they're in day to day. So that was something that I also wanted to address. So I wanted to know more about sleep and exercise and how it relates to cognition in HD, but more so, we wanted to study people in their homes and see how they're actually functioning in their home, not just in the hospital or the university clinic. So the way we did this was we had 42 amazing people with the expanded HD repeat take part in my study. So 20 had been diagnosed as symptomatic, clinically manifest HD, and 22 of our participants had not yet been diagnosed with Huntington's disease. Now, we asked our participants to wear Fitbit sleep and activity monitors like this one. They were able to measure how much exercise they were getting and measure some elements of how they were sleeping for a week. We also had a smartphone application that people downloaded on their phone called HD Mobile. And people logged into the app and answered some questions as well about their sleep and physical activity. So we had some sleep and physical activity info from the Fitbit, but also from questions that we had people answer each day. Now, in the app, HD Mobile, we also had cognitive tasks, so tests of thinking ability that tested, for example, people's memory for visual information. So we had something like this on the phone screen where people would be shown a few images like this in different locations on the screen. Then there'd be a small break, and then we test how well our participants could remember these pictures by showing more pictures and then asking, have you seen this object in the past, in the previous step? So then we're able to see if people were shown this image, could they remember it later on, for example. And we also tested people's decision-making abilities. This task is a little bit complicated, but what it did was we had these red dots showing up on a screen, and we asked people if there was few or many dots on the screen. But our participants didn't know where the cutoff was for few or many, and we had people make use of feedback. So if you got the answer wrong, you'd get this little sad smiley face, and then you would try to adjust your answer later on. But for the most part, we were just seeing how well people could make decisions about the number of dots on the screen and how well people could learn from feedback, if the little sad or happy faces. So what we did, we had people, we measured the sleep and physical activity habits of our participants for 1 week. And then on the morning of the 8th day, so after a week of collecting sleep and physical activity information, we had people do these tasks to test their visual memory abilities and decision-making abilities. And we had some quite interesting results. So first of all, we found that participants who spent more time in bed tended to remember less images on the visual memory task. So we think that this measure of the amount of time people were spending in bed may have reflected worse sleep quality at night. So we're all probably familiar with the idea that when we have a poor night's sleep, we wake up a bunch of times for whatever reason. Once that alarm goes off in the morning, there's a chance that we might turn it off and need to go back and try get a little bit more sleep, spending more time in bed, so that we can feel rested. Whereas if you get a good night's sleep, you may get your 8 hours and wake up and you're ready to go. So this measure of time in bed was really a measure of how long people were trying to sleep for. They'd press a button on the Fitbit when they're ready to go to sleep, and when they're ready to wake up, which might be straight as the alarm goes off, or if you didn't sleep too well or whatever else, you may decide, I'm going to go sleep for a bit longer, right? We just found that the more time people spent in bed trying to sleep ended up that they would remember the images here less well, so less likely to have an accurate answer to whether or not they'd seen the image before. And also people responded slower. So not only did those who spent more time in bed have kind of worse visual memory, they're also slower in answering. And I've just got a graph here to show the representation here of the two. So along the bottom axis here, we have the amount of average minutes people spent in bed trying to sleep during the week. And here we have the percent of images that people remembered. So you can see average amount of sleep sort of between this 400 to 500 kind of minute mark. As people were needing to spend more time in bed than that, they started getting lower accuracy on this test of memory. The other task that we had, the decision-making task, for this one we found that participants who are less physically active tended to make fewer correct choices on the decision-making task. Now we have a quick graph to show you for that one as well. So here we have activity calories per day. So this is calories that people burn moving around and doing exercise and doing housework or walking down wherever they were going. As people tended to do more exercise, when asked to decide if there were few or many dots on the screen, people's decision-making ability and ability to maybe even learn from feedback on this task got better when they were doing more exercise. At least that's the association that we found. So just moving on to our conclusions. First of all, we seem to have now a growing evidence to suggest that healthy sleep and physical activity habits tend to associate with better cognitive functioning for people with the expanded HD repeat. So I mentioned earlier that in the background section that there are a few studies that showed when people were waking up later in the morning that they tended to perform a little bit worse on cognitive tasks. And we found a kind of a similar thing, but with more time people spent in bed, they tended to perform a little bit worse. And my study and the Wallace et al. Study both tended to show that as people were doing a little bit more exercise or more physically active, they tended to do a little bit better as well on cognitive tasks. So a really important point to make just here is that this doesn't show that 100% for sure if you sleep better or are more physically active, you will help yourself think better or have better cognition. We can't make that cause and effect claim. So far, all we can say is that this tends to be an association when people that have healthy sleep or are more physically active, they tend to do a little bit better on cognitive tests. But we cannot say for sure if you start exercising more today, you'll think more clearly tomorrow. We need further studies to show that. But one important point I want to make is that we were able to show this relationship between the sleep habits and physical activity habits and how people were performing cognitively, how well they were able to do these tasks of thinking abilities. We showed that healthy sleep and physical activity are associated with better cognitive functioning in the home, not just in the clinic. So I think this is really important because we sort of have this real world example now that not only can we say if you go and do some tests in the clinic, doing well there associates with more exercise, for example. We showed that more exercise and better sleep associated with better cognitive functioning in the home, which is critical. Now, as I said, we only have evidence now about association. Healthy sleep and physical activity associates with better cognitive functioning in a few studies. That's really starting to emerge. But we can't say for sure that one leads to the other. And that's why we now need these long-term studies where we follow people for months or years. And we need these studies to understand, firstly, if and how long-term sleep and physical activity can help slow cognitive symptom progression in HD. So hopefully we can run some longer-term studies and see that if you're more physically active now and sleep better now, you can slow progression down the track. And we're in a really good place to do that now because we have the Fitbit monitors and we have these apps where people can log in once a month, once a week, whatever, and take some cognitive tests. And we can start to track these things over the courses of months or years and really hopefully have some answers that we can bring to the HD community and give tools that you all can use to manage your symptoms. Just to finish off, just want to say thank you to everyone for their attention today. A big thank you to everyone who participated in my study and gave their time, and a thank you to all my supervisors and collaborators on the project. So thank you everyone for your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the community day. Thank you.
I got Huntington's disease, and my mom had it. My auntie, my brother.
I am Steven's support worker. He has been doing very good regarding his exercises. So Steven has got his own trainer for exercising. So all of his support and his motivation helps him do more exercises.
Gym. I love the gym. Weights. I love boxing.
How often do you go boxing?
Twice a day. I love it. My trainer keeps me motivated. It's not that hard, but it's good motivation.
Motivating.
No movement when I exercise. No, exercise is good for you. It will help you. Lift your finger at your butt.